This is not a dragon. This is a long. Moreover, this cannot be a dragon, even if it wanted to be, because that's not how language works. This thing exists. This thing exists in the real world. If all the humans on the planet disappeared tomorrow, this thing would continue to exist. If all of the humans had never lived, this thing could still be here. Let's say you and I are taking a look at this thing, and I say, hey, in my language, I call this thing goat. And you say, oh, in my language, we call that thing cabra. You and I can say, okay, then in your language, the word for goat is cabra, because we're looking at this thing, and we know we're looking at the same thing. Thank you. Mythological creatures are different, though. Mythological creatures are not animals, they're stories. And if you and I are from the same society, the same culture, and we both are familiar with the same set of mythology, then we can use the words for the mythological things not to point toward real animals that exist in the real world, but to point to real stories that exist in the real world, even though those stories are about imaginary things. We use the words dragon and fairy and luong and leprechaun and unicorn and Darth Vader not to refer to real things that exist in the world, but to refer to real stories that we are both familiar with. In Europe, there is a shared cultural concept, a shared story of a dragon. And that story goes, a dragon is a scaly and malevolent monster that breathes fire and terrorizes the villagers, and the hero has to slay it. But that story, that shared bit of fiction, never reached China. However, in China, there is this shared cultural concept, this shared story, and that story goes, there is a creature called a loon. A wise and mysterious creature, a scaly lizard-like thing that is attracted to running water, and if you're nice to it, it will be your guardian or your guide, and if you're not nice to it, it will just ignore you. And that is a story that never reached Europe. When European traders first started making contact with Chinese society during the Renaissance, they saw statues and paintings and heard stories about these luongs, and they looked at it and they said, I don't know what that is, but it is scaly and lizard-like. Therefore, dragon. That's a mistranslation. That's a conceptual mistranslation, because dragons and luongs are not animals, they're just stories. And they're two very different stories. Literally the only thing they have in common is they kind of look like lizards. If your culture and my culture have things in common, then we can have a word for both of them. We can have a word for goat. We can have a word for rain. We can have a word for hunger. We can have a word for love, because those are all things that your culture and my culture both have. But a piece of storytelling, a piece of mythology, that's something that can exist in your culture and only your culture in isolation. And when that is the case, any words that you have in your language that are pertinent only to the story will not have an analogous equivalent in other languages that do not have access or familiarity with the story. A loong is not the same thing as a dragon. Therefore, the word loong is not just the Chinese word for dragon. The word loong is the Chinese word for loon. You don't have to take my word for this. 2024 was a year of the dragon in the Chinese zodiac. And in 2024, the Chinese government announced from here on out, in all of our English language communications and statements, we will no longer be calling this the year of the dragon. We'll be calling it the year of the loon. Part of it is about national pride, right? It's saying, hey, we have our own culture that is independent of European culture. But also part of it is just about literal linguistic accuracy.